So many weeks with a very sharp question from Shem Shmuel, the second Sachachover Rebbe. Yaakov Avinu is told by Rivka that he's in danger. After he receives the blessings, he receives the brachas. So Aso says that he's going to kill him. So she comes up with a plan. She says, Kum brach lecha el Lovan. Go run away to my brother's house, to Lovan. Okay? That's the escape, that great escape that Yaakov Avinu makes. The Shem Shmuel asks, wait a second, what would stop Aso from running after Yaakov to Lavan's house? It wasn't like it was that far away. It wasn't that he somehow went off to Australia and Aso couldn't get after him. It also tells us in the pasuk that Aso knew exactly where he was. Okay, because he says that when Aso heard, right, that Yaakov sent him to Padan Aram, right, in Pasuk Vav, Perek Chavches, Vayar Aso. Aso saw, Keberach Yitzchak is Yaakov, Yitzchak blessed Yaakov, V'shilach oso Padena Aram lakachat lo misham isha. And he sent him to Padan Aram to find his shidduch, to find his wife. So Aso knew the address. When we add in the Midrashim of Chazal that says that at this point, Aso was already an accomplished murderer. So why does he suddenly become this dysfunctional wimp? Why is it that he just doesn't go after Yaakov and kill him in Lavan's house? There are a variety of approaches. The question is asked in other places. But the Shem Shmuel comes with a psychological concept. He says in the following way. He says, Kol Adam, each person, ech shehu ba'atzmo, the way he is himself, kachu machzik et chavero. That's the way he defines his fellow man. In psychological terms, I believe it's called projection. Projection. Okay, so Aso was projecting himself on Yaakov. Why was that applicable here? Because there were conditions built into Yaakov's bracha and Asav's bracha. After Aso cried and asked Yitzchak, is there not a bracha for me? So he said, you know what? He said, Al charbecha tichya, you will live by the sword, vet achicha ta'avod, and you will serve your brother. Parenthetically, just this amazing parsha everybody should know, right? Still far from the holiday season. There was somebody called Rav Moshe Chaim Vali, who was a student of the Ramchal, of Rav Moshe Chaim Lutzato. He wrote a big parsha on the Chumash called Or Olam. And on this pasuk, where Yitzchak tells Aso, Et achicha ta'avod, you will serve your brother, he says, when did that happen historically? When was Aso Yaakov's servant? So he said the pirush that he received from his father and father's father, etc., as ta'avod here doesn't mean physical servitude. It means religious worship. You will worship your brother. When does Aso worship Yaakov? There's a religion that worships a Jew. It's a chicha ta'avod. That will happen. He says that's how that plays out. But then he tells him, this word ka'asher tarid is a strange word. It would sound like in the pshat that it means you, Aso, will go down. But it means that Yaakov will not do what he's supposed to. The Targum Onkelos says, Kad yavrun benohi, when Yaakov Avinu's children will transgress pizgome oraisa, the laws of the Torah, v'tadi nirei me'al tzavarach, you will throw off his yoke from your neck. So Aso, who was so disturbed about the fact that Yaakov got the birthright and got the brachas, realized that there's a failsafe in there. There's a condition. It only depends on Yaakov continuing to be such a good boy as he was. But the minute Yaakov and his descendants stop that, everything reverts back to that true firstborn, the physical firstborn to Aso. The House of Lovan was not a simple place spiritually. Okay, Lovan, when you flesh it out with the Midrashim, Lovan, who again, people have to admit, when they read the psukim in the pshat, Lovan doesn't seem like such a bad guy. It's true, he's not nice to his son-in-law, but many people are guilty of that. You know, that's there. But to see that he reaches the level of what we say in the Haggadah, according to most Perushim, Arami Oved Avi, there was an Aramean who wanted to destroy my father, that's Lovan who wanted to destroy Yaakov. We don't see destroying, we don't see. So Lovan was a person of great spiritual powers. He's viewed as the predecessor of Bilam. Bilam was a descendant of his. In the more mystical books, it talks about even Bilam being like a reincarnation of Lovan. And Lavan's powers were so great. First of all, we have to realize that Hashem spoke to him. When he was pursuing Yaakov, Hashem appeared to him to get him to stop. Part of the reason why he would be equated with Bilam, who was that one among the nations who was allowed to receive a certain level of prophecy. And the warning to Lavan is, don't say anything to Yaakov, mitov adra. Why doesn't it say, don't hurt him, don't shoot him, don't beat him up? Because Lavan didn't fight in those ways. Lavan fought with spiritual powers. The Zohar HaKadosh says that nobody entered the house of Lavan without being taken over by his negative spirituality. That was the house that Yaakov was going to. So Esav projected. He said, okay, Yaakov is the goody-goody, and Yaakov got the brachas. You know why? Because he has no life. Because he's been stuck there in the Mea Sharim Bnei Brak of Yitzchak Avinu's tent, right? Learning Torah all the time, Yoshev Ohalim, and now he's going to Vegas. And when Yaakov Avinu goes to Vegas, it's all gonna end. I don't have to go after there. I don't have to kill him. Yaakov Avinu is going to turn into Fast Jake or something like that, which is going to be over there. It's going to be gone. I don't need to. Because Esav was projecting. Esav felt, how would I respond to that world of negative spirituality and everything is there? For sure, I'd be on the train. And he couldn't imagine that Yaakov actually really wanted to be that good because he wanted to, and that it could be so strong that he would want to be that good and that true, even exposed to the other things. So therefore he felt it wasn't necessary. It's a fascinating parish. And we should know, sociologically, that is marketed to this very day. So many people say, yeah, you see, it's true, there are still Jews who are keeping Torah and mitzvahs in that way, but that's because they keep them sheltered. They keep them sheltered. Let's take them out on a little field trip. Let's let them see the world. Right? Suddenly, they'll be throwing it off left and right. The danger is there, but that's not necessarily true. So Rivka Imenu, who again knew Lavan's house very well, right? She's described as that person whose father was a Rasha, whose brother was a Rasha, and she wasn't taken over in that place, but she knew what it was. How did she send Yaakov there? Because she saw Yaakov differently than Esav. She saw Yaakov following her path. She lived there, and she not only resisted, but she flourished. She became greater by being there. That was how she was able to send him and to do that. Now, Yaakov was more cautious though. Chazal speak, Rashi brings it down here about the missing 14 years. There were 14 years that Yaakov did a little detour on the way to Lavan's house. And this was in this yeshiva of Shem Ba'ever, right? The yeshiva of Shem Ba'ever. Now, what was there for Yaakov Avinu to learn in this yeshiva of Shem Ba'ever, this mysterious place? Avram Avinu was alive for much of Yaakov's life until now. Yitzchak Avinu was there to teach him all the truth that he would need to know, all of these things. Why did he have to go? What did he have to do? First of all, I want to share with you a fascinating parish from the Talmud Rebbe about the description of Yaakov in the beginning of the story, which kind of leads to that Esav projection. It describes in the beginning of the parsha, Vayhi Esav, ish yodea tzayid ish sodeh. Esav was a person who knew hunting, he knew the field. He would be on the cover of Field and Stream magazine or one of these things. This was. And Yaakov ish tom yoshev ohalim. Yaakov was a person, tom can mean whole, it can also mean a certain innocence, who dwelled in the tents, right? Who lived in the tents. Rashi says, what are these things? Yoshev ohalim, so ohalo shel Shem and ohalo shel Ever, right? The tents of Shem and the tents of Ever. He knew those tents already earlier. He was familiar with what was there. Why was he going then to the tents of Shem and Aver, even before his trip? So the Toldos Rebbe said like this: there's got to be a balance here. It looks so unbalanced. Jews are very challenged when it comes to the world of the outdoors, at least in recent centuries. We're not outdoors people. We're not the hunt and fish and, types of folks. We became these very citified people. The wisdom of the field, the wisdom of the outdoors, the wisdom of survival, the wisdom of hunting is great wisdom. It really requires a lot of wisdom. And that's what Aso had. To be a ish sadeh, ish tzayid, that means you know the different seasons. You know the habits of the animals. You know the ways in which to hunt them. You know how to survive in the wild if you're not catching any animals. It's a great wisdom that people go to learn. Yaakov Avinu, if he's being portrayed as this counterpart to Esav, he must also have some great wisdom. What does he have? He sits in the tent and he learns. It doesn't sound, but he says, pay attention to the word ohalim. It doesn't say Yoshev Ohel. He sat in the tent. He sat in many tents. He was the spiritual hunter. He was the one who understood, just like the hunter knows that there are so many ways and so many animals and so many seasons and so many different types of terrain. Yaakov Avinu from his youth was growing to draw and to learn the different types of Torah from the different teachers who were there in his generation. That's a picture that all of us are supposed to have. I heard a fascinating story. It's brought down in the biography of Shlomo Freifeld, the founding Rosh Yeshiva of the Shar Yoshev Yeshiva in America. And I actually heard from his daughter that this story is actually spot on. There's a gentleman called Rafael Franklin. Rafael Franklin was a young Jewish man who spent a large part of his youth living with a tribe of, now I think the PC thing to say is First Americans. Used to be Native Americans. When I was a kid, it was the Indians. Okay, he went and he joined one of these tribes and he lived with them. And he wanted to learn their wisdom that they had built up over thousands of years, especially this idea of hunting, which was very central to these tribes. Eventually, he got interested in his Jewish roots and he migrated to the Northeast. And he was having a hard time in his interactions with frum people. Because you're sitting at that Shabbos table you got invented, so where'd you come to New York from? South Dakota? Really, what were you doing there? Well, I was living with the, Cherokee Nation or something like that. Really, why? Well, I wanted to learn their traditions of hunting. Really, why? It was just, he felt very, so he said, he was always going to give up. And he met Rav Freifeld. And same questions, where were you living, really, what were you doing? And Rav Freifeld said, what did you hunt and how did you hunt it? And they talked for hours about that wisdom of hunting. He said that was what connected him. Now he actually runs a very high-end, free-range, healthy poultry farm in the Catskills, Pella Poultry. I don't get any proceeds, right? Very fancy, healthy stuff. Okay, so this is, Yaakov Avinu was aware of this center of learning that was called the Yeshiva of Shem Ve'ever. Before he went to Lavan's house, he stopped there for 14 years. It seems disrespectful. Your mother told you, go to Lavan's house. Your father told you, go to Lavan's house and find a wife and get married. Yaakov Avinu says, this Israeli motion, I'm on the way, I am, but first I got to stop there. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky has a very famous and fabulous explanation for what he was looking for. He says, Yaakov Avinu till now was in a very protected environment. He was in the world of Yitzchak and Rivka, of tzaddikim, and he was now going to have to go into a world that was not just antithetical to everything he stood for, but was on the attack. He knew that he was not prepared, or at least he feared that he was not prepared to do it. Rivka had confidence in him. He didn't share that confidence, at least yet. Shem lived in the Dor HaMabul. Shem was a son of Noach. Shem saw the world which opposed Noach, which was corrupted, and how one has to resist that. Ever, his son, saw what was called Dor HaPalaga, that generation of Migdal Bavel, the beginnings of the leadership of Nimrod and all of that, and he learned how to deal. Yaakov Avinu said, I have to go learn from them before I go. Rabbi Yaakov continues that in fact we find, Chazal tell us that Yaakov gave particular Torah over to Yosef, aside from the other brothers. What was that Torah? That same Torah. That he knew that Yosef would also have to be able to survive out, not in the physical wilderness, but in the spiritual wilderness, which turned out to be Mitzrayim. And this is a very important skill to learn. It's important to realize that sometimes when a Jew is too naive and not able to understand that there are those who actually, sometimes under the guise of being kind, want to destroy and manipulate, they can fall prey to it. Some pointed out that this is why Jews in the Sephardi countries fell prey to the alliance from France when they came there, because Jews in Ashkenazi countries had been involved in battles with assorted people who were changing and reforming at the time. But here, the idea that a Jewish group coming over saying we want to help improve your lives was actually trying to detach them from Judaism was just too foreign to them, and they weren't prepared. And many of them fell to that before they were able to get their breath. It's a particular form of battle that Yaakov Avinu knew that he had to learn. Okay, so what we do understand, though, is that Yaakov Avinu's struggle in the House of Lovan wasn't something that he just survived, but he thrived. That was how he became Yaakov. That was how he became who he was supposed to be. The people he married, the children he was supposed to have, the experience he was supposed to have, all came from that struggle. And therefore, what we have to understand is that the struggles that we go through, that we're put into, Yaakov Avinu could have cried out at the injustice. I was a good kid. Why do I have to run away from this murderous brother and go to a place that is the last place on earth that I want to be, and to go for a long time? But the understanding is that struggle can bring out in us who we're supposed to be challenged, particularly in those ways which were the ways that Lavan challenged him. This started from the beginning of his life. Listen to an amazing thought. Rabbi Yeshua of Kutna, he was one of the great poskim of Poland. He was known as the Yeshua's Malko, is the name of his sefer. He talks about this strange image in the beginning of the parsha of the two twin embryos that were running around in the womb. Okay, Rashi brings down the idea that they were each running to different spiritual magnets outside of Rivka's tummy. But another explanation which is brought in the Medrash is that from the womb, Esav was already attacking Yaakov. They were fighting. And the end of that fight, or that stage of the fight, was at the birth with Yado Ochezet Ba'akev Esav. Yaakov Avinu's hand was grabbing the ankle of Esav. So the Rishonim already mentioned, I saw it in Rabbeinu Bechaye, he says, usually if you have twins, okay, and don't catch me on the anatomical science here, I'm not an expert. He said, usually if you have twins, they're in two separate placentas, two separate sacs. So Yaakov Avinu shouldn't have been able to get any place near Esav's ankle. He said it has to be that in this case, either these sacs opened up, giving access, or for some reason they were in one sac. So Rabbi Yeshua of Kutna, he says you can take that a bit further, because science does know what happened if two embryos are in one sac. If the two embryos are in one sac, they can become conjoined twins, what the world calls Siamese twins. The fact that they're there and growing together, if they come into contact, so then parts of their bodies will meld together and they'll become one. He says that Vayisrotzitzu Abanim, the fact that they were in opposition in the womb, stopped that process from happening, enabled Yaakov to be distinct and separate from Esav. So Rivka, who was suffering so much to the extent that she said, why am I? Which some of the Mepharshim say, why am I even alive? That was actually what brought about that differentiation of Yaakov from Esav. From the very beginning, there was such a key. This gives kind of in the beginning the spiritual DNA of Am Yisrael, the knowledge that the opposition that we face The struggles that we have aren't a sign of rejection, as many nations tried to point to the Jews and say, God has rejected you. But that is particularly what enables us to live and thrive, especially since we have to be a separate nation. In the Haggadah, we say, V'hi she'amda lavoseinu v'lanu. Okay? And the famous question, all the Haggadahs asked, who is he? Right? V'hi she'amda. Right? And this, right, stood to our forefathers and us. One of the perushim you find is that which the Haggadah continues to say. The fact that there's constantly been attempts to destroy the Jewish people in every generation, and every generation when we read that in the Haggadah, it's true. It changes geographically, it changes from nation to nation. But right now there are people trying to gear up their nuclear weapons and would like to do away with us. That itself keeps us strong. That itself brings identity, oftentimes from that opposition. Reb Chaim Volozhner explained it, he gave a cute phraseology. He said that when a Jew doesn't make Kiddush, the non-Jew will make Havdalah. Meaning, if the Jew doesn't dedicate himself to his identity, so Hashem arranges it that he meets his identity through the opposition of the non-Jew. Time and time and time again, that's happened throughout Jewish history. And while we never wish for it and we don't look for it, we can understand that that can be a type of survival aspect. This is also true in terms of the battles we have with our own opposing spiritual forces. The attacks that we have of the Yetzer Hara, attacks on us that we think, why? Right? I'm trying to be good. Why would Hashem send this problem to me? Why would he send this temptation to me? Why would he put me in this situation? We have to understand that those very things are that which make us who we're supposed to be. Those things help us grow. Those things are designed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to help us get there. The Rebbe often tells a story about his grandfather, Yochanan Twersky. He grew up in America in the early 1900s, right, in New York. His father had to run away from Russia. They ended up in the Lower East Side. And it was not a place in which there were Hasidic teenagers, really. Almost nobody. Again, the Jews of that age who were remaining Shomer mitzvahs were so few. And he tried. He, in fact, asked for his bar mitzvah for a very surprising present. He asked to be able to go to Yerushalayim to learn Torah. He went on a ship to Yerushalayim. He came to the old city then. I think it was in the 1920s, and he learned Torah here. So he, when he returned to America, the Friedricher Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, came to America. And he went into him to ask him for a bracha. So the Rebbe was very old at that time, and he was not so well. He said, what would you like a bracha for? He said, I want a bracha not to have nisyonos, not to have tests. And he said that even though he was old and he was weak, the Lubavitcher Rebbe became very strong and agitated. And he says, "Steigt nicht." It doesn't work. That doesn't work. There's no such thing as life without nisyonos. But the young Yochanan Twersky wasn't giving up. He said, but every morning we say, Al tivieni lo lidei nisayon. Don't bring me to tests. He says, you're not finishing the sentence. It says, Lo lidei nisayon v'lo lidei bizayon. Don't come to a test that's going to end up in your shame, right? In your having. But tests, he says, they're going to have to be. So this shows us that approach of Yaakov Avinu. He knew he had to go into this test, but he wasn't foolish enough to realize that if you go, he did realize that if you go into a test unprepared, you're likely to come out lidei bizayon. He took the steps necessary to learn and prepare and to learn from all those he had to in order to be able to survive and to be victorious. We're not supposed to look to be tested. Hashem gives us plenty of tests in our own, right? It's not something a person looks for. That's even disrespectful for that which we're entrusted with, the heritage we're supposed to protect. Don't look to be tested as some kind of spiritual building exercise. But there will be tests, and there will be many tests. And a person who's a Yoshev Ohalim, who's that person who knows the spiritual wild and has learned the spiritual survival skills, is going to try to learn from different teachers of Torah and different Sfarim of Torah to learn the different ways that he can be prepared for the different things that can come out. This leads us, as we head toward a finish, toward the month of Kislev, which is coming up, and toward the Yom Tov of Hanukkah. It's a famous question by the Bach, Rav Yoel Sirkis, who perished on the tour, the Bayis Chadash. It says, Chazal, in general, in examining Am Yisrael's experiences with what's called the four Malchios, the four kingdoms that we were enslaved under, they give us a reason for why things happened. The first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because Jews had transgressed these three cardinal sins, Avodah Zarah, Gila, Arayah, Shvichus Damim. The second Beis HaMikdash by the Romans was destroyed because of Sinas Chinam, spaceless hatred. At the time of Purim, the Gemara brings down the question, why is it they use what's called Lashon Saginar, Son'eim Shel Yisrael, the enemies of the Jews, really means the Jews. Why were the Jews liable, worthy to be destroyed in that generation? And there were a couple of explanations. Some said because they enjoyed the Suda of Achashverosh that Mordechai told them not to go to. Others said because it goes further back in Bavel, that they bowed down to the idols in Bavel because of the command of the king. They didn't really mean it inside, but they did it outside. Hanukkah, zip. Nobody tells us anything. The Greeks came into Israel, and it started off fairly peacefully with Alexander the Great. The pressure on Jewish life, Jewish identity grew greater and greater. As there was some infighting and civil wars and resistance, it eventually ended up with Antiochus at the end of 200 years of what we call Golus Yavan. And it got very rough, and it led eventually to Hanukkah. But why should the Greeks mess with us? We had returned to Israel. We had rebuilt the second Beis HaMikdash. Anshe Knesset Agdola set up all sorts of wonderful foundations in the way we served Hashem. Why? The Bach says, because there's a danger in those times as well. When you're successful and times are quiet, the danger is that you will fall asleep. You become robotic in your service of Hashem. You simply go through the motions. If you're not challenged, if you're not fighting resistance, you can end up sleepwalking to your own destruction. He said this is why this came. And in fact, the Navi describes the struggle between Greece and Am Yisrael. It says, "Va'orarti es banaich Tzion al banaich Yovan." I will awaken the children of Tzion against the children of Yovan. The victory over the Greeks has to come through awakening. And the awakening comes oftentimes through pressure. The Shem Shmuel in Chayesara, in that year it came out, Rosh Chodesh Kislev. So he spoke about, many of the Sfarim, the old Sfarim, talk about the astrological signs of the months and the connections to it. He said the astrological sign of the month is the Keshet, the bow. What do they call it in the horoscope pages? Sagittarius. There you go. So he says, why is that the sign of Kislev? Because the bow is only functional when the pressure builds up and it's drawn far back. Only then can it achieve its purpose and shoot. He says that's the picture of what was happening with us and Yavan. So we go from Yaakov Avinu in the womb to that world of the struggle and the fight and the oppression which is there. And we know that that'll be the relationship between Am Yisrael and Esav, because the pasuk says, Ulaom milaom ye'emotz. One nation will get stronger. We translate it often, than the other nation. The Sfas Emes says that means from the other nation. The relationship between these two twin brothers, Yaakov and Esav, is when one is up, Chazal said, one is down. Zekom zenofel. Just as twins both draw their nourishment from one mother and sometimes compete for that same food source, so too, the rise of Rome represents Am Yisrael not being who they're supposed to be. Only when we rise does Rome take its place underneath. That's the struggle that's going on, and that's what's there. And a person has to learn to embrace that in certain ways. There's an expression we find in Tanakh, and it's especially sung every Friday night, Eshet Chayil. Eshet Chayil, right? And Boaz is described as an Ish Chayil in Megillat Ruth. What is that explanation? What is this Chayil? So I heard from Victor Miller once, years ago. He had a very interesting way of speaking. He says, what that means is, he said, Hashem does not want you to be a frum log. Right? Don't be a frum piece of wood. Chayil, he said, means a fighter. Okay, Jews are not into military pageantry. We are not people who adulate, right, killing and fighting. It's something we pick up when we have to do, when we're forced to by our enemies. But we are meant to be fighters in the spiritual sense at all times. Right? These little pictures in the bencher of the Eshet Chayil just being, this little woman in front of her candles, really, she's a fighter. Right? It's not just woman of valor, it's this superhero, valor woman, right, who fights for the Jewish family and fights for all these things. You have to realize that that's what and who we are. Rav Hutner wrote a letter to a student once who was complaining about all of his terrible tendencies and downfalls. And he said, you are walking in the path of tzaddikim more when you are wrestling with those struggles than when everything is going well for you and you're calm and peaceful in your service of Hashem. That is the true picture of what and who we are. So on one hand, it's there, and a person who wants to become a ger tzedek, the first thing they tell him is, do you realize that this people has been oppressed and attacked more than any other in history, and it still goes on? If he says, I know that, and I would like to be worthy of joining up with that, you say, you can come in. That's strange. Do we want masochists? Right? Are we looking for, right? But what he understands is that that is the way it has to be. That is our destiny in order to become who we're supposed to become. So that is part and parcel of who we are. And the danger of when we stop being fighters is what we see in Hanukkah, the idea of falling asleep. And sometimes, as painful as it is, we have to realize that the opposition that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends our way is actually that greatest thing that wakes us up and makes us alive, right? And helps us be there. When you look at astronauts, there's an interesting health difficulty that astronauts face. When they're out in zero gravity, so very soon their muscles get very weak and their bones get brittle. Why? Because even though zero gravity is cool and you can float around and do somersaults in the air, you're fighting no resistance at all. And even a couch potato among us gets strong by fighting resistance, right? You still have to pick up your beer, right? Sometimes fighting gravity. You have to pick up the remote control. Sometimes you even have to get up and walk to the fridge for another beer. All these things are fighting resistance and making us strong and healthy. The world of the physical and the world of the spiritual are parallels. If we simply desire a life in which there'll be no challenge to us spiritually, so then our spiritual health will deteriorate. Embracing that, understanding that, walking in the pathway of Yaakov Avinu, it's not rejection. In the Haggadah, we give a description, a brief history is brought there from Sefer Yoshua of our nation. And it reaches the demarcation between Yaakov and Esav. And it says, Va'etem la'Esav es har Seir l'reshet oto. I gave Esav the mountain of Seir to inherit. Very nice real estate. V'Yaakov u'banav yardu Mitzrayma. And Yaakov and his children went down to Egypt. Now, this little paragraph gave us the selection process among our ancestors. Avram Avinu had Yitzchak and Yishmael. Yitzchak was chosen to carry on the line of Avram Avinu. Yitzchak had Esav and Yaakov. Yaakov was chosen. Okay, what happened to Esav who was rejected? He's doing fine on Har Seir. And Yaakov, the chosen one, what happened to him? He and his children went down to Egypt for a few centuries of slavery and torture. That's chosen? That's the chosen people? In fact, it is. So when Islam And Christianity, especially when you look in the writings of the Rishonim, who had to defend against these constant attacks of saying, you people have been rejected. Read the writing, right? It's like some people, if somebody said they don't want to go out with them anymore, they just don't get the message, and they have to, get somebody to get very tough with them to tell them that it's over. So I say, you Jewish people keep saying, we're the chosen people. He burnt down the Beis HaMikdash. He scattered you out into exile, where everything in the world is done to you. Read the message. Change your t-shirt from chosen people to rejected people. So it says. We read it differently. We see this already time from the Yaakov, whose very name comes from that struggle in the womb. Yado ochezes ba'akev Aso. Struggling, fighting, trying to reach up, and eventually even reaching that level of Yisrael in the upcoming parsha. That's who we are. That's the true story of Hanukkah and what it's about. And the true celebration of Hanukkah is waking up to who we're supposed to be and not falling asleep in that amnesia of assimilation. Okay, all, have a wonderful week, a wonderful Shabbos.